Have you ever wondered why generations of British wrestling fans all seem to share the same memories? The town halls, the theatres, the holiday camps, the glossy programmes, the larger-than-life villains, the family atmosphere, the foam hands. If you grew up watching British wrestling after the television boom of the 1970s and 80s, there was a handful of promoters responsible for keeping that experience alive. But the one that stands out the most was Brian Dixon. When Brian passed away in 2023, people didn't just mourn a wrestling promoter. Many felt we were saying goodbye to an entire era of British wrestling, and I completely understand why, because Brian wasn't simply someone whose shows I attended. He was the man who gave me my very first opportunity in professional wrestling. Hello everyone, I'm Josh Faulkner, the wrestling comedian. Make sure you drop a like and give me a follow. This is part one of the incredible story of Brian Dixon. Every wrestling promoter starts somewhere. Most don't begin with money or television deals or famous wrestlers. They start exactly where all of us do, as fans. Brian George Dixon was born in 1947 in Liverpool. Growing up, Britain was entering what many people now call the golden age of professional wrestling. Television audiences were exploding. Venues across the country were packed every week. The stars of wrestling were becoming household names. And for a young Brian Dixon, there was one place that captured his imagination more than anywhere else: Liverpool Stadium. Today, it's remembered as one of the true cathedrals of British wrestling. Week after week, some of the greatest names in Europe appeared there. Heavyweights, middleweights, lightweights, women wrestlers, international visitors. It wasn't simply somewhere Brian watched wrestling. It became the place where he fell in love with the entire business. Not just what happened inside the ring, but everything around it. The posters, the crowds, the anticipation, the atmosphere. Long before he ever promoted a wrestling show, Brian was already studying them. Most fans watch wrestling. Brian wanted to be involved in it. In the late 1960s, he became heavily involved in the A to Z Wrestling Fan Club, one of Britain's best-known wrestling supporter organisations. Remember, this was decades before Facebook, before YouTube, before wrestling websites. If you wanted to connect with other fans, you joined a fan club. Brian helped organise newsletters, collected photographs, corresponded with wrestlers, built friendships across the country. He later became closely associated with the Jim Breaks fan club, developing relationships with many of the biggest stars of the time in British wrestling. It might not sound particularly glamorous, but those fan clubs became Brian's wrestling education. He discovered what fans wanted, who drew crowds, which wrestlers people talked about, how promotions communicated with supporters. Without realising it, Brian was already learning to become a promoter. Eventually, Brian's enthusiasm earned him opportunities behind the scenes. He became involved with the wrestling at Liverpool Stadium itself, working as a referee, as a second, helping wherever it was needed. And that's where Brian received the greatest education any promoter could have. Because running a wrestling show isn't just about putting two names on a poster. Someone has to hire the building, book the wrestlers, arrange transport, sell tickets, organise advertising, print programs, handle emergencies when wrestlers don't arrive, pay everyone at the end of the night. Brian watched all of it. He absorbed everything. The experienced promoters probably had no idea, but standing quietly on the edge of those shows was the man who would eventually outlast almost every single one of them. Then, Brian met someone who completely changed the direction of his life: Mitzi Muller. Mitzi wasn't just another wrestler. She was one of Britain's very best female competitors. Women's wrestling in Britain has always occupied a strange position. Audiences loved it, but opportunities weren't always consistent. Promoters often treated it as an attraction rather than an essential part of every show. Brian believed differently. According to one of the stories often told over the years, whilst refereeing one of Mitzi's matches, Brian accidentally stood on her long hair during the contest. It certainly wasn't the smoothest introduction, but eventually the two became a couple, then husband and wife, and together they would build one of the most important wrestling companies Britain has ever seen. Brian later said that seeing the difficulties Mitzi faced in securing enough bookings convinced him that instead of waiting for opportunities, he should create them himself. That decision would change British wrestling forever. In October 1970, Brian branched out from the Liverpool Stadium and launched his own company, Wrestling Enterprises of Birkenhead. At first, it was incredibly small. There was no television, no national reputation, no guaranteed audiences, just determination. Brian himself booked the halls, promoted the shows, handled the administration, worked with the wrestlers. He wasn't sitting in an office giving orders, he was doing absolutely everything, and perhaps that explains why decades later he never lost touch with the realities of promoting. Brian understood every single job because he'd done every single job except wrestle. There were obstacles, of course. It wasn't just plain sailing. In fact, when Brian ran his first show, the evening's takings were stolen out of the boot of his car as he enjoyed a post-show meal. Brian wasn't trying to copy Joint Promotions. He couldn't. Joint Promotions had the biggest stars. They had the television contracts, the established venues. Instead, Brian built something different. He focused on exciting cards, strong family entertainment, international visitors, women's wrestling, young wrestlers looking for opportunities. He looked for places where other promoters weren't looking. He thought differently, worked harder, traveled further, and slowly the audiences started growing. Then something happened that nobody could have predicted. A young promoter from Liverpool who had started out running wrestling fan clubs was about to challenge the most powerful organization British wrestling had ever known. Joint Promotions, and incredibly, he was going to win.